It is Saturday, August 31st, 2019, and we still are talking about the big headline, Major Hurricane Dorian, that stands at a high-end Category 4 hurricane at the moment. Here's how it looks on satellite imagery. Overall, a somewhat small storm, very compact and very, very powerful. You can see it kind of looking like a buzzsaw heading towards the northern end of the Bahamas. We're going off the 2 o'clock advisory numbers. Every 3 hours, we'll get a new update from the National Hurricane Center. Right now, we're up to 150-mile-per-hour winds sustained, with gusts upwards of 185. We are now moving due west at 8 miles per hour, continuing to slow down. 2 advisories ago, we were moving at around 12 miles per hour, so this is getting close to a crawl. The central pressure has been dropping like a rock, 945 millibars at the moment. Here's the northern part of the Bahamas. The SAFFIR-SIMPSON scale is how we gauge the wind speeds and the strength of a hurricane, 1 to 5. Right now, we have 150-mile-per-hour sustained winds, and that's a high-end Category 4. There have been some missions flying into the hurricane from the hurricane hunters, finding winds in excess of that, approaching Category 5 status. So we'll see if Dorian does in fact make it to Category 5 as it bears down on the northern Bahamas. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. We had talked also in previous videos about rapid intensification. Well, according to the National Hurricane Center, the definition for that is an increase in the maximum sustained winds of at least 30 knots in 24 hours, or about 34 miles per hour. Looking back at the last 24 hours worth of observations or advisories from the National Hurricane Center, we went from 110-mile-per-hour winds at the 11 a.m. advisory on Friday to 150-mile-per-hour winds at 11 a.m. today. That's an increase of 40 miles per hour. Rapid intensification has been achieved. Also notice the correlation here between the dropping pressure and the increasing wind speed. We dropped 27 millibars within the last 24 hours. And of course, those wind speeds, as I mentioned, increased by 40. So we have achieved that rapid intensification. Overall measurements on this from Miami, about 400 miles to the east of there. There are the northern end of the Bahamas that are under some hurricane watches and warnings right now. The overall size of the storm hasn't really changed much. In fact, it may have shrank a little bit. Overall, the most powerful portion of this system is obviously the one that looks the most impressive. Thunderstorms all around that very well-defined eye. We do have some lagging convection thunderstorm activity on the eastern end of it, but those strongest winds being found right around in this area, that northeast quadrant. We do have an eye on the system. It's about 15 miles in diameter. The average size of an eye, 19 to around 40 miles in diameter. So this is on the smaller side, but that's not a surprise. Smaller eyes are common in very intense hurricanes there, and we'll look for an eye wall replacement cycle to get underway, hopefully leading to some brief weakening here in the next 24 hours or so. And I'm going to talk about some weakening factors in just a minute. But the overall forward motion, as you saw there on the advisory, is to the west at 8 miles per hour. We're finding those hurricane force winds, 74 miles per hour or greater, at around 25 miles out from the center in that northeast quadrant, 25 miles out in the southeastern quadrant, and then also a little bit less as you go over to the southwest quadrant there in the northeast, matching that. In terms of tropical storm force winds, those expand much farther out from the center, almost in every quadrant up to around 100 miles out from the center, the exception being that southwestern quadrant reaching only around 60 miles out, and those tropical storm force winds need to be in excess of 39 miles per hour. All right, the bigger picture here, this is a freight train heading towards the northern Bahamas, and if you continued it on this path without any disruptions or any upper air features changing its steering, it'd be heading right towards that east coast of Florida. But models have been changing for the better for the east coast of Florida. However, no change for the better here for the northern Bahamas. The Grand Bahama, Great Abaco, and Eleuthera, all under hurricane warnings and watches here, meaning that the threat of a very impressive, very strong, damaging hurricane is imminent. Those hurricane warnings up for the islands in the purple, reds indicating those hurricane watches that will likely be upgraded to those hurricane warnings within the next 12 to 18 hours there. So really keep everybody there in your thoughts for devastating storm surge and strong winds. Visible satellite imagery here. This has just been a textbook-looking hurricane. You have something called the stadium effect here, and if we tilt the imagery a little bit, you can see it. Those towering thunderstorm clouds encircling that well-defined center. You can see straight down to the surface of the ocean if you are flying overhead that. In fact, in the center, you will find completely calm winds. The strongest winds are going to be in that outermost cluster of thunderstorms called the eye wall. And those winds are packing a punch, gusts up to 185 miles per hour, just crazy fast. I did mention the possibility of some weakening opportunities. In the short term, we're going to watch for something called the eye wall replacement cycle. You can see the well-defined eye there. Over time, with very intense hurricanes, that eye tends to collapse in on itself. It leads to a brief period of some weakening, followed by strengthening in the replacement of the outer eye wall. Sometimes it's even a little bit larger than the previous. And the size of the storm seems to get bigger after that, too. So even though it does present intensity drops in the short term, it leads to overall strengthening of the system. And it is a sign of a healthy storm. Longer term, down the road the next couple of days, we're going to talk about something called upwelling that'll eventually possibly weaken it as it gets on through the Bahamas. But there's something that's going to probably strengthen it. And I'm going to show you that in a second here. Sea surface temperatures along its entire track, really the entire part of the Atlantic Ocean here, are well above average, about a degree or so. That doesn't seem like anything to you and I, but those numbers are 84 to 86, and that's that much more energy available for this storm to take advantage of and turn into wind energy. And as it's moving off towards the west, it is starting to slow itself down a little bit. It is moving over an area that doesn't only have very warm sea surface temperatures, the skin of the ocean, the top 10 meters or so, but that heat energy extends down to a great depth. So even though the forward motion is slowing down, something called upwelling will take over. So the winds are really strong in a hurricane, obviously. It's going to mix up the ocean. And if we didn't have this deep heat content here, those temperatures didn't extend down to a depth, it would eventually mix up cooler waters from below and replace the warm waters at the surface with cooler temperatures. And that would lead to a general overall weakening. Now, that in the short term could be that with that slow movement there. So that's a good thing that it's slowing on down, because it may just deplete the heat energy that's available there and mix up enough cool water to slow it down or at least weaken it slightly. But it's not going to last forever, because you know what's out ahead of it? The Gulf Stream. And even though it's going to be somewhat crawling when it gets to this point in its forecast track, we have the Gulf Stream that, even though upwelling will be occurring, the Gulf Stream will replenish those warm waters at depth continually. It's going to have a continuous source of fuel coming in from the south here. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the storm is doing when it gets to this point out in its evolution. And that's still about 3.5 days out. That's how slow this thing's going to move. In fact, some models even indicate it's stalling out off the coast of Florida. Here is that track from the Hurricane Center. This is the 11 o'clock track. We get track changes or updates every 6 hours. So the next one coming out at 5 p.m. and then 11 o'clock tonight. No real changes in the overall intensity. However, there is a big shift eastwards in the overall cone of uncertainty. There's a reason why it's called the cone of uncertainty, because it can track anywhere within this cone, the center. It's a relatively larger storm, so around 300 miles in diameter, so anywhere in this is going to have impacts well outside of it as well. Now, that center, that median, the average of all the models, keeps it offshore. Now, that's some good news for the east coast of Florida that just a couple days ago was looking at a direct hit from a major Category 4 hurricane. However, this now puts in play the Carolina coastline, areas that were ransacked by Florence last year. This also has a lot of similarities to another storm that's recent memory, Hurricane Matthew, back in 2016. We're going to talk about that track and any similarities with the overall steering with this as well. So I don't want you to look at this and say you're out of the woods in Florida, because it's still certainly not out of the realm of possibility that we could still see this track farther to the west and impact more of the coastline there. So there's a lot that can change here. The smallest thing that can change has a big overall impact. The steering has been the big problem. Hardest thing to kind of nail down as we're tracking Dorian. I like to equate this to a math problem. Have you heard of the two trains math problem? You have two trains leaving from two different cities, traveling at different speeds towards each other, and you try to figure out where they're going to meet each other. Well, you know the speeds in that math problem. Here, you don't. That's the hard part. You're not knowing the speeds of each train and as they're traveling, when they're going to meet up. And the trough here is train number 2. Dorian is train number 1. Train number 2 is set to meet Dorian, train number 1, at some point now, indicated by the models, off the coast, picking it up and driving it to the north. If, however, train 2 slows down a little bit or train 1 speeds up, that whole timeline of when they meet gets pushed a little bit farther to the west, which is why Florida was under the gun for so long. So we really have to watch it closely. Things can still certainly change. Here's all the computer models, the spaghetti plots we like to call them, keeping the majority of them, in fact, all of them, with one outlier that's moving off to the south, off the coast of Florida. However, look what's under the gun now. The possibility of Wilmington again, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, parts of South Carolina there, and even the potential there for southeastern Virginia to see some impacts from this as we get towards the later part of next week. Let's look at the GFS and the American model here. There's the center of Dorian tracking off the coast of Florida, moving very, very slowly. As we lift northwards, you see the impacts scraping along the coastline of the Carolinas before zipping out to sea by the later part of next week. You look at the European model, very, very similar here, with the tracks off the coastline there, meandering for a bit, bringing some wind, some storm surge along the east coast of Florida, then moving up into the Carolinas, same areas that got hit by Florence, and over southeastern Virginia before it heads on out to sea there by the end of next week. So those two models in very good agreement. There are some changes in the overall probability of seeing the hurricane force winds. They have dropped off significantly through Florida. Of course, with the Bahamas almost a sure bet of seeing those hurricane force winds and stronger, and that shifts off towards the north as well, similar to the track from the National Hurricane Center. Despite a track of Dorian sitting off the coast of Florida, we still have to talk about storm surge. That is still going to be a big issue all along the southeast coastline. With the winds coming onshore, piling up that water, we could see storm surge levels well above the normal sea levels, especially because king tide is occurring this weekend and for the next couple of days, which already adds to it astronomically higher tidal cycles. Rainfall will be an issue too, although you look at the GFS model here, keeping the heaviest of the rain along the immediate coastline and really coastal North Carolina and South Carolina into southeastern Virginia, 10 to 20 inches. This will change, but it's something that we really have to keep an eye on there, coupled with some storm surge possibilities through the Carolinas and Virginia. And the ECMWF, the European model, right on target with that. No heavy widespread rainfall back inland far out from the track, so that's a little bit of good news. Let's look at Hurricane Matthew, because that's been thrown out there saying, this track looks very similar to Matthew. Matthew developed in the way far south from where Dorian did, okay? But it did track similar as it got closer to the United States, right along the east coast of Florida, and then kind of straddled the southeast coastline before moving out to sea off the coast of Virginia, causing a lot of damage back in 2016. It did achieve Category 5 status, but not as it was along the coast of Florida. That was back down well to the south, and it hammered the southeast coastline. If you're wondering how many Category 5s have there been out in the Atlantic Basin, well, let's just go back the last decade, and we had 4. We started with Matthew back in 2016. 2017 had 2 Category 5s, and last year, Michael made landfall. Just before landfall, it achieved Category 5 status in the panhandle of Florida. So could we see Dorian achieve Category 5 status? It's not outside the realm of possibility, and that would likely occur probably within the next 24 hours, if at all. So we're really going to watch it closely here, and it's not the only thing we're watching. 2 systems out there in the Atlantic. One, not so much going to be an issue in the southern Gulf heading towards Mexico. One, though, that has emerged off of the coast of Africa, an African easterly wave that within the next 5 days has the chance at becoming Fernand, which would be the next named system. All right, that's the update for this afternoon. We'll have another one this evening. We're going to stay ahead of that storm for you all day long, all weekend long. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on this channel to make sure you're notified when we put one out there. In between those, if you want to find me on social media, you have a question, I'll be happy to answer it on Facebook, meteorologist Tim Pandages, or Twitter at 13 Tim Pandages.